Well, good afternoon. As you probably know by now, I'm Michael Hall. I'm a professor here in the political science department at Wichita State University, and this is our third class in national politics for the lifelong learning program. And I want to welcome those of you again who've shown up again. Thank you for your persistent support. And I have been asked to go over some ground rules again. I know this is coming to the point for many of you that's like that presentation they do at the beginning of every airline flight. You'd rather thumb through your magazine or your novel, for example, rather than listen to something you know all again. But please do, we all need reminders from time to time. And I will go over some ground rules again, if only because, in the case of a water landing, your seat cannot be used as a flotation device. So please pay attention to the forward cabin. Please remember to turn off your cellular phones, or at least put them on vibrate setting, so that we don't have a phone going off in the middle of the presentation. That makes it a lot easier for people to hear everyone. I remembered I had to do that before I started this lecture. Please also remember that if you have questions and you're watching this, for example, online, you can email questions even in real time to lifelonglearning@wichita.edu. In fact, you can do that sitting there if you want to. Mr. Herdano, sitting in front, will be collecting those questions. He'll pass them on to me, and I'll try and answer those questions as often as I can. And also, if you have a question but you'd rather speak to me in person, we do have a microphone set up right over there that will allow people to stand. And if you can line up and keep social distance from one another, please make sure to address your question into the microphone. I'll try to remember to repeat your question and then address your question as best as I can. Obviously, of course, I want to thank all of you who are wearing masks. Looks like just about, excuse me, I need some water. I've got some with me. I just need to take a drink of it. But thank you for wearing your masks. I realize in these difficult and strange times, it's worth it for everyone to be wearing them if they can, as long as there are no respiratory problems to have to deal with, which are understandable. I'm not wearing a mask, of course, in case people are experiencing this for the first time, simply because the presenters of lectures in these series have been told that it won't be necessary for us to do so. It makes everyone, since you are sitting so far away from where I am, it's not necessary for me to wear a mask. They do clean these microphones pretty routinely. And also, if people want to come speak to me during a break or after time, I will make sure to put on my own mask and address people from 6 feet away as best I can. We will be having a break in the middle, sometime in the middle of this session. And so if you do need to get up, freshen up, there will be a break coming shortly. Now, I got a couple of questions over email, especially from a number of our online students. And one question I had was a continuation of a theme we were talking about last week. We were talking about elections last week, and I had detailed, for example, about how different states basically run the regulations of how voting works. It's up to each state to determine the laws concerning voting in each particular state. And just about every state in the Union, in the United States at least, has rules requiring people to register to vote. Now, these vary, of course, considerably from state to state, but the onus is on the individual to take the effort to find out how you register to vote in your particular state, what forms you fill out, when you have to have them in by, what county office you need to have them in for, all those sorts of regulations. I had a question come in over online about whether or not I foresaw any sort of future where we might gravitate towards a more national system of registration, or, as I mentioned before, instead of the system we have in the United States, something a little more European or Japanese, where people do not register themselves to vote, but it's on the government actually to keep lists of registered voters and to maintain those, and that people are signed up automatically through that system. I was asked, would the United States, could I foresee a time when the United States would gravitate to any sort of system like that? How I responded to this student was to say I considerably doubt that we'll end up gravitating to a national system of registration. Or national system. I mean, the federal government does have voting laws for federal regulations, to be sure. It's allowed to do that. That's why we all end up voting, for example, on the president of the same day, all across, for all 50 states on the union. But will we ever have, say, a national system of registration or national all voting laws in the United States vested in the federal level? I sincerely doubt that. Remember, I said really this is vested in the Constitution, which grants the states the power to define how voting laws work in a particular state and how the registration works. To change the Constitution would require a constitutional amendment, of course. What does it take for a constitutional amendment? To make it official, to get it ratified, takes, as we mentioned before, 3/4 of the states to ratify such an amendment, and there's very little incentive among the states to actually change, to give away the power that they have over voting to the federal government. So it's politically unlikely that would happen anytime in the foreseeable future. Would there possibly be a movement towards automatic registration of people instead of the system we have now? That's also unlikely, but it is not outside the realm of possibility. That is to say, the people who, after all, decide the rules at the state level about how our voting laws work, by and large, well, how did they get to where they were? They got elected through the current rules. And in many cases, incumbents of both parties don't have that much incentive to change the rules about how voting works. If there was, to say, rules to make it easier for people to be registered, and that would, increase voter turnout, some incumbents might end up finding themselves losing their seats. And so politically, we generally figure there's not that much incentive they have to change a lot of the voting laws in the United States. However, that being said, it's not impossible. I mentioned in the first week of this course that one scholar, Samuel Huntington, argued that every so often, about every 60, 70 years or so, we go through these periods that he called creedal passion periods where our politics get focused on reform of the system. And usually in those periods, there are changes to the way voting laws work. In the 1830s, for example, voting rights were extended to men without property. And in the early 1900s, the first primaries to select nominees for parties were introduced, hoping that that would take the political process out of smoke-filled rooms, having party leaders choose who the nominees were, and instead give more power to the people. It's conceivably possible that if there was a groundswell of support for having, an easier system of registration, that maybe some politicians would take note, ride the wave of public opinion, and help themselves get elected just through trying to change the laws and make things easier for voters. It's possible. It's just not necessarily likely. And that's how I respond to this particular student. Another question I got in over email had to do with the judicial nomination process. And obviously that's been a key point in the news very recently. I had a suspicion when I got that particular question about judicial nominations, now that we've all learned, of course, that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg died just between these past two classes. And there is now going to be set up to be a political fight over replacing her on the Supreme Court. I had a suspicion there may be some question. Instead of just talking about lobbying and interest groups today, maybe there'd be some questions about judicial nomination that I should address. I'm going to take a few minutes at the beginning of this lecture to do so. Many of you are, of course, well aware of what the Constitution basically lays down about the Supreme Court and how members of the Supreme Court are selected. We have 9 total justices on the Supreme Court. They are all appointed by presidents of the United States. The Constitution clearly gives the president of the United States the power to make appointments, not just to the Supreme Court, but for all federal judges. So that means judges at the appellate level, judges at the base level of what we call district courts. There's a 3-tiered system of courts for the federal judiciary in the United States. The president appoints all of those justices when there are vacancies. All right. And very oftentimes, of course, it's these appointments to the federal judiciary that become sometimes a president's longest lasting legacy. Because since federal judges keep their terms for life, many judges will sit on courts for some decades after their appointment, for example. And a lot of the reason we've had many conservative justices on the Supreme Court right now goes back to having, on balance, more Republican than Democratic presidents in the past few decades. And so the majority of our justices are currently conservative. But the power to put people on the Supreme Court, of course, does not just simply lie with the President of the United States. It also belongs to the Senate. According to the Constitution, as again, many of you are probably well aware, the Senate has to give its advice and consent. That's really all that the Constitution says, that the Senate gives its advice and consent to all federal appointments, including judges. That phrase, advice and consent, has often been interpreted simply to mean the Senate must confirm a nomination with a majority vote. And being that there are 100 senators in the Senate, it only takes a vote of 51 senators or more to confirm a justice to the Supreme Court. Now, obviously, this has become a political lightning rod just within the past few days, and we've seen a pattern of this. We've all seen a pattern of this over the past few decades. Almost every single time a nomination comes up, it is a politicized fight over which party is going to get its way in terms of who the justices can be on the Supreme Court. I do want to say, by way of introduction, it wasn't always this way, actually. Judicial nominations in many decades past used to be a matter, in many cases, of questions about was the nominee qualified to be a member of the Supreme Court, a member of the judiciary. A lot of the focus in Senate debates was actually not about what party the president belonged to, wasn't about what party or ideological persuasion the nominee belonged to, but was often a question of legal credentials. Had they served as a judge before? In what capacity? Had they written notable opinions on a number of cases? What was their legal background, for example? If they weren't a judge, for example, were they a law professor? Had they had experience, serving in a legal field of some kind, maybe in the executive branch for some time? And people would debate the qualifications. Sometimes some of the more unusual appointments, Justice Earl Warren, who became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court through the late 1950s and throughout the 1960s. He was not a judge, to my knowledge, before becoming Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. He was governor of California, actually. And there was debates over whether or not there was enough qualifications for him to take a position in the judiciary. Those were the kinds of debates a lot of politicians had. Things started to change, and we can actually mark when this changed, roughly around the late 1980s, with the nomination of a single person. His name was Judge Robert Bork. Some of you may recall that name. This being the late 1980s, it was President Reagan who was trying to fill a vacancy on the Supreme Court. And in doing so, what he tried to do was Reagan made a point of trying to satisfy conservative positions, especially in the 1980s, as something we call now the culture war was heating up. Questions about abortion, prayer in schools, about legalization of marijuana, all kinds of questions about the culture of the United States and what sort of legal rights people had under the Constitution, or also questions about criminal rights. What were the rights of the accused, for example? All these sorts of things. Reagan wanted to put a particularly conservative stamp on the court, so he nominated Judge Robert Bork, who had an illustrious career in law. He had been the Solicitor General at one point under the Nixon administration. Unfortunately for him, at a high point in the Watergate scandal, where there are questions about whether or not special prosecutors would continue to investigate Watergate, for example. Bork was involved in that. But being Solicitor General, what that meant was Bork had been in charge of all the U.S. attorneys that prosecute cases for or defend cases for the U.S. government in federal judiciaries. After doing work as Solicitor General, he moved on to an illustrious career as a law professor, specializing in antitrust law at a major Ivy League university. I can't remember which one. But he wrote books on judicial philosophy, which were routinely cited and well regarded in the legal profession. Bork was nominated. There was no question about his credentials. He had as good credentials as just about anyone could wish, but he was known to be at the time a hardline conservative, one with what we call a strict a strict constructionist interpretation of the Constitution, or an originalist position where he believed that justices should interpret the Constitution very narrowly to stick to the letter of the law and not interpret things widely to assume that the original founders meant anything more than what we can historically prove that they wanted. And what that meant was that a lot of opinions handed down by the old Warren Court, which tend to be very liberal, he opposed in many cases. His nomination process went before the Senate. Before it goes to the full Senate, the Senate handles this work through committees. The Senate nominations for judiciaries go entirely through one committee, the Senate Judiciary Committee, which interestingly enough at the time was headed by a name you should be able to identify. Joseph Biden, the senator from Delaware, a Democrat, held the chair position on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and the committee was run at the time by a majority of Democrats. They held the majority of Senate, so they held all the chair positions and the majority positions in all committees. That's a tradition of the Senate and the House. Biden and his fellow Democrats took an unusual step of questioning Bork on a number of his opinions and the content of his opinions, and questioning his ideology, whether or not that was whether or not his conservative ideology and the way he particularly had a certain philosophy of law, whether that philosophy of law was actually the appropriate sort of law position that we should have the Supreme Court. And in the end, despite Bork's qualifications, he was turned down for a nomination. Largely on ideological grounds. This set a kind of new precedent. Not that ideology never mattered before, but this set a kind of new precedent where the focus started to be on how would a judge rule, how would a nominee rule should they become a justice on the Supreme Court. And part of the reason both Reagan made the nomination and also Biden and his fellow Democrats turned him down had to do with two things, one of which we've already mentioned, the increasing polarization of the two parties, which was starting to become apparent even back in the 1980s, especially as the culture wars were heating up. And it also is a function of something that I am going to be talking about for the balance of our time today, which is also the role of interest groups. It never used to be in several decades past, when Earl Warren and others were being appointed to the court, that many people, many ordinary citizens would take a huge interest in who was being nominated to the court. And there wasn't necessarily a lot of politicking going on by public opinion or interest groups about who would sit on the court. Presidents made their nominations, senators would debate it, people would be confirmed or denied, people would read about this in the paper and say, oh, got new justices, and kind of leave it at that. But as the culture wars started heating up, both presidents and senators were starting to get more intense lobbying from organized groups of people pushing for certain positions on the court. Organized pro-choice groups, for example, would ask pointed questions about what is this nominee written, for example, about abortion in the past, and pro-life groups would do the same. What has this nominee said about abortion in the past? Or what have they said about legal philosophy, which would give us clues about how they might rule should they get on the court. And it led to a new line of questioning in Senate debates about how senators would start increasingly sit and asking them about legal philosophy. And if a case like this came before you, judge, or Mr. or Mrs. So-and-so, how might you rule on this? And in the process of doing this new line of questioning about the content of how they would decide cases, you could start to see the process of checks and balances also show up and break out, because senators of whatever party would start asking questions, how would you rule on a case like this? Effectively, that's what they're asking. And the nominee would be coy, a little shy, and say, well, there's a principle in law, you don't rule on a case until you have all the facts before you. And so senators might elaborate on a hypothetical case, and they say, well, this is all hypothetical, I can't commit myself to anything. And there's this dance back and forth between the senators who want certain outcomes on the court and nominees who, by virtue of being justices, it doesn't matter what ideology or party they belong to. The justices want the independence and the discretion to rule as they see fit and not want to be boxed in a corner as making commitments to these kinds of things. You'll see this play out, I'm sure, in the next Senate confirmation process. You'll see that same kind of dance back and forth that's been going on for the past few nomination contests. And a lot of, more and more votes coming down along party lines. When these things come before the Senate, this never always used to be the case, but has become more important now. The question I did get from an online student, for example, had to do with, suppose a senator, if I interpret the question correctly, suppose a senator loses the election come early November. Do they still end up voting on a nominee after they've lost an election? And the short answer to that question is yes, they can, up until noon on January 3rd. I looked this up. According to the 20th Amendment, which is more, according to 20th or 22nd Amendment, sorry, which is more famous for putting limit, actually, no, it's the 20th Amendment. I'm sorry, 20th Amendment, which moved up the date. It's most famous for moving up the date of the inauguration from March 4th to January 20th. A presidential term officially ends at noon on January 20th of the year following an election year. But the term for a senator or a representative officially ends on noon of January 3rd following an election year. So strictly speaking, even if they lose an election, they are still officially a U.S. senator after that, but up until noon on January 3rd, as long as the vote on the nomination is scheduled before then, yes, they still have the authority under the Constitution to vote on that nomination. This is, after all, arguably one of the reasons why it does seem like the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, seems to be in a rush to get this nomination process finished. We are not sure at this point. I said last week that it does seem, all things being equal, and yes, there could be any number of surprises in the next few weeks or changes, Biden is the odds-on favorite, but not necessarily certain, to win the presidency. We're still a lot more uncertain about who is going to end up controlling the Senate after the next election. Another reason why, despite the Electoral College, it's a good reason to get out and speak your mind about who you think the next senator from Kansas should be, for example. We're not sure entirely who's going to end up controlling the Senate. There is a possibility that the majority of the next Senate will be in Democratic hands, and that the current minority leader, Chuck Schumer, could become the majority leader. But this has, of course, ramifications. Also, according to the Constitution, the Senate makes its own rules on how its procedure works. As long as they're not violating any constitutional laws or other laws, they can make their own rules and procedures. How do those rules get formed? Well, a majority of the Senate votes on those rules and votes to establish those rules. Hence, and we've also noticed, of course, over time that since more and more senators vote the party line, doesn't matter if they're Republicans or Democrats, more and more Republicans have voted the party line over the past few decades, more and more Democrats have voted party line over the past few decades. We can actually track this with statistics on voting records of senators and representatives. This ends up giving the majority leader of the Senate quite a lot of power in setting the schedule for how the Senate does things and the rules under which the nomination process works. So if Mitch McConnell wants to hold a vote, and it looks now from the latest news that he will have enough senators to back him on this, yes, a nomination process probably will take place very shortly after President Trump, who has claimed that he'll have a nominee, I think this Saturday. The nomination process will probably take place, if not before the election, shortly afterwards. All right. And that's a lot, that's a lot of more background than maybe you want to know about this, but hopefully I've answered a number of questions you might have had. If you have other questions, of course, feel free to go up to the microphone and ask me about the process. I told you also that we'd be talking about interest groups and lobbying today. We will. That's where I'm going to spend the balance of my time. I just thought, since the death of Justice Ginsburg had created such a huge new feature, huge new issue in the news cycle, I ought to say something to address this point. And because I wasn't originally going to talk about the judicial nomination process, I thought this is a timely time to do it. But when we talked about elections last week, notice on the title slide, I call it the electoral connection. And there's a reason for that. Elections are one way, for example, we connect people, on the one hand, citizens of the United States, to their government. Citizens have a role to play in selecting who the leaders who make their decisions are. And that in turn means that leaders, maybe they follow public opinion, maybe they don't, but they have to keep an eye on how voting works and how voters are making decisions, if only because that's the way they stay in office. But it serves as a connection between citizens and their government. So does lobbying. Lobbying is, of course, different from elections. Lobbying is that activity where groups of citizens organize and they form groups called interest groups, sometimes called pressure groups, sometimes called vested interest groups. But all of these are groups which are organizations, private organizations of citizens, not members of the government, who decide that they want to come together and push the government some way, somehow, to adopt certain policies. Instead, now they can play roles in elections, to be sure, but very oftentimes when we think of lobbying, we think of guys we think of people, often men, in suits better than mine, ties and shoes more expensive than what I have, and they visit various Congress people and they make appointments and they talk directly to Congress people saying, this is what we want. Congress people saying, well, exactly, do you have plans for this? Or these are my qualms or qualifications, and there's back and forth dialogue. That's what we often think of as lobbying. Okay. That's the kind of thing we're thinking. That's the kind of thing we're often thinking of. I'm going to argue it's actually a bit broader than that. And this phenomenon of lobbying is a very multifaceted activity, which involves not just the interest groups, but of course the Congress people and bureaucrats who are on the receiving end and who want things, for example, from those that are pushing for certain policies, these interest groups. And also that interest groups come in many different forms, sometimes more than we normally think about, for example. More than we normally think about. This also forms a connection, This also forms a kind of connection where people find ways of connecting, making their views known to the people that govern them, and also having a part in the process of how things are decided. Next week, we're going to be focusing on the process of governing. I'm going to take you through how the policymaking process works from about start to finish, and spend a little more time on the institutions of government, particularly President and Congress, and their roles in politics. But I want to spend some time today talking more about the role of citizen input into that process. Here is just a small sample on this first slide. Here is just a small sample of different interest groups, some of which need no introduction. AARP, as I'm sure many of you are well aware of, is the American Association of Retired Persons and represents a variety of senior citizens across the country. ACLU, of course, is the American Civil Liberties Union. It is a group that fights for what they see as civil liberties under the Constitution, often known to have a liberal or a left-wing bent to them. The AFL-CIO is the largest umbrella group of labor organizations across the United States. There are some 50 to 60 different separate labor unions which all come together in this broader organization called the American Federation of Labor / Congress of Industrial Organizations. I also have up there Koch Industries. Of course, we know one of the biggest industries here in Wichita. They can form an interest group as well, and of course, the National Rifle Association, or NRA for short, lobbies on behalf of expanding and defending gun rights in the United States, often known to have a conservative bent. What I have in the different columns, for example, are the resulting memberships of these different organizations. Notice how they vary a lot, all right? Arguably, what may be the single largest interest group in terms of just membership is arguably AARP. There may be some other group out there that's even larger, but AARP certainly has a claim to being in the top 3 or top 5 in terms of just sheer membership in the United States. But others can be smaller. Koch Industries is not so much necessarily a sort of It's clearly not a nonprofit organization. It's not simply a collection of people who just volunteer to sign up. But throughout Koch Industries, they have roughly, from what I can gather on the internet, about 100, about 100,000 employees. 100,000 employees, either in the United States or worldwide. Now that I think about it, I didn't look that up exactly. But sometimes these groups can be really small in terms of numbers and membership. The other figures that are there are just the other figures that are there for those that have acronyms. That's the total membership of the organization. Obviously, when people look at numbers like that, we know how political power works. The more people you have behind you, the more you can organize votes behind certain specific issues, and the more that you can tell politicians, hey, we have a membership this large, and we have so many members in your particular state or your particular district. We serve a big voting block. You need to listen to this group, and this is what we come bring to bear. On the right-hand side is either revenue or budget figures. These numbers are not necessarily consistent in terms of being 2019 or 2020 figures. I simply went on the internet and found the most recent figures I could find, that all of them are just a few years old at best. But notice it varies considerably. AARP actually the last revenue statement they released publicly, they got $1.6 billion of revenue. A lot of that, of course, being through dues, but through other activities that they do, through other activities they can do. I can talk about that later on. Notice how one of the smaller ones there is the ACLU with a $300 million budget. A lot of that going to pay for lawyers who end up serving ACLU views in court, for example. That's what a lot of that budget goes to. And as you go down the list, make sure that you note there's a difference there between million and billion. And of course, billion is 1,000 times larger than a million. Okay, easily on that list, Koch Industries has an annual revenue that outstrips any of these other organizations that are up there. So in terms of the power of money, understandably, large organizations tend to do better than smaller organizations. But that being said, corporations easily have some sort of political power to play with in these examples. So much so familiar. But notice that if we really were to, this is not, of course, a complete list. We could end up talking about thousands upon thousands of groups, which could arguably be called interest groups of some kind. There's a huge variety of them. What we're most familiar with, of course, when talking about who does the lobbying and who these interest groups are, first thing that often comes to mind are corporations, understandably. When questions come up about corporate tax law, federal regulations, questions about health and safety of workers, how you hire and fire workers, for example, in a variety of other, particularly economic issues, obviously corporations do a lot of lobbying on a variety of those issues. Just below that is a form of interest, is a collection of interest groups. Sometimes we're kind of dimly aware of them, but they serve actually as, historically, a very important collection of interest groups. And those are trade associations or professional occupations, for example. For here, I can actually jump down to the bottom of the list. One of the oldest professional organizations in the United States was simply called the Grange. Nowadays, you would talk about farmers unions or farmers associations. It's escaping me. I'm married into a farming family, and I should know the name of this farming association offhand. I'm sure one of you will probably tell me later on during break. But back in the 1800s, farmers, of course, who often made up the most populated occupation in the United States, would start to organize. They would start to meet one another and start to organize and say, "Hey, look, we all have some common interests in common in terms of how the government treats us and the laws that gets passed. Let's start forming a block and telling our senators and representatives these are things that we want." And especially in many states, well, in just about any state, actually, even those that had some industry, for example, like New York and Pennsylvania, In the centers of those states would be some more rural areas where the towns pretty much revolved around agriculture. And these organizations could become very powerful voting blocs, um, pressuring various senators and representatives. And that even if the senators and representatives knew they wanted to listen to some of their industrial corporations because they had their own mercantile concerns, to be sure, farmers would organize and use the power of themselves as a voting bloc, sometimes to intimidate legislators pretty successfully. Hence, of course, for example, there's an elaborate system of farm subsidies in the United States, which is in due no small part to farmers saying, "Hey, we need assistance from the federal government, especially when natural disasters strike or there's foreign competition or the prices of various farm products are uncertain. You need to make sure that we have a consistent income coming through subsidies to make sure we don't get out of business permanently." Other people look at that and say, well, that's just an example of pressure politics. A certain group of people say we want money, and legislators just hand it to them. Take your pick as to how that works. But this is one of the older examples, and between them, various farming associations, corporations, and trade groups. I go back to that. Various other professions would look at what the farmers did, not just what the farmers did, but various professions would see that if they organized, they too could actually put pressure to bear on certain issues. So the American Bar Association, which of course is a group organizing lawyers across the United States, can also form a lobbying group, especially when it comes to questions about judicial procedure and the law about the law, for example. The American Medical Association gathers together doctors, for example, and they can lobby and do lobby Congress on things to do with healthcare, for example. There is even an organization called EggPAC. I've heard about a long time ago. The egg farmers have their own organization and donate money to various campaigns. These trade associations can get very specific. All right. So that if it has to do with plumbers and contractors who are concerned about building codes, for example, there might be some sort of professional organization that represents these people. And even if they compete with one another on a normal business basis, they'll unite together if they feel they have common interests in policy, and they'll make their voices heard. Labor unions started to come around, of course, in the early 20th century. Despite no small part in various government officials and business officials trying to break up labor unions did succeed in trying to organize factory workers for questions about health and safety, wages, policy about what gets done in factories, to be sure, and often became, of course, some of the main opposition to many of these business groups that are listed above. But as what unions, of course, had a key advantage in organizing lots and lots of people. There are, of course, more workers in factories than the people that are running them and administrating them. So labor unions were able to bring together large voting blocs, and especially during the 1930s and the Democrats under the New Deal, they became a key part. They became a key part of a lot of New Deal legislation, and providing some of the political support for that. Corporations and trade groups and agriculture groups have been around in American politics for a long time. If you wanted to hear the boring details, I could tell you stories. There can be stories to be told about how Congress would debate various tariffs. The power to levy taxes on imported goods, which are tariffs, is ultimately vested in the Constitution in Congress. And if you're confused about that, I can tell you more later. But it's actually ultimately vested in Congress. And there used to be a time, especially in the 1800s, where Congress people would have these knockdown, drag-out debates over how much tariffs there would be on steel, on, say, foreign cotton, on foreign wheat, et cetera, et cetera. And they would set the exact prices of exactly how much would be charged. Various groups, of course, like these, the agriculture groups and the agriculture groups, the businesses, the trade associations, they would come in and contact their representatives about what they thought the tariff should be, higher if they wanted to keep out foreign competition, or lower if they wanted to sell more of their products abroad and encourage other countries not to put tariffs on our goods, for example. There used to be these knockdown, drag-out debates, and I only bring this up because lobbying goes back a long way in American politics. So far, not surprising. But it's that fourth category which is arguably the biggest development. and one of the biggest changes. There never used to be a lot of what we called citizen groups. Citizen groups are these sort of nonprofit organizations which collect people together not on the basis of how can they make more money, but more on the basis of there's a certain cause that they're trying to promote. The ACLU and the NRA, despite being very different positions on the political spectrum, they're both members of citizen. They're both categorized as citizen groups. These people are organizing not really to make money. I know there can be some. I know there can be some snide jokes about the sort of money these groups make, but quite realistically, that's not the purpose of these groups. These people that join these groups are committed to some kind of cause, be it say First Amendment rights or Second Amendment rights, and they gather together in organizations to try and promote those causes. These groups never used to be that common in American politics, but starting from about the 70s and 80s onward, this is where we've seen the biggest explosion. Especially, as I mentioned before, those culture wars that started to erupt after the 1960s caused a number of Americans to start saying, I like these changes, I want to go forward, or I think we need to resist these changes because American traditions are being eroded. All kinds of groups started organizing more on the basis of what they saw as constitutional questions or questions about the culture, certain ideals that they see fit, of course. And as they grew in number, they started gathering more money to donate to campaigns, organize bigger and bigger voting blocks, for example. And now, now it's common, for example, despite whatever one's opinions are about this, after, say, news of mass shootings would break out in the American news, some people would say, is this going to be the time now that Congress or various states pass, more restrictive gun control legislation? And very frequently, of course, these things would be blocked. We all know what the political force blocking them was. It would be the National Rifle Association, which was saying, hold on here. Do we really want to take these steps? Are we sure we're not going to be infringing on the liberties of people in trying to deal with, inflamed tensions that come from mass shootings? And of course, those, take your pick on this. Those that feel that Second Amendment rights are important feel that the NRA is providing a service in defending the rights of individuals under the Constitution. Those that favor gun control saying, look, there's an increasing majority of people who favor more restrictive gun control legislation to do something about the mass shootings we've had over the past several years. But this one minority group is blocking all that through the power of their lobbying. We have these debates continually, and thanks to citizen groups, this is happening more and more. This is happening more and more frequently. There's a lot that could be said, and after a break, I'm going to be talking about the role that money plays, for example, and I'm going to be talking about the role another form of political power plays, the role of the political power of information, which we hear much less of, but some scholars are starting to think is actually maybe some of the most important power that any lobbying group actually wields. But I do want to spend some time before the break talking about the way a lot of people think the power of interest groups is supposed to work, that of organizing people. And that is to say, so far we've been talking in very simple terms. The more people that a group can organize, the more politically powerful it is, and generally that's true. But when talking about this, people generally have in the back of their minds the sense of, well, if there's just a lot of people who believe in this cause, or they have this financial or fiscal interest in these kinds of policies, well, of course they'll want to join that group. And then it's just a matter of, well, how big is that category of people across the country? It turns out it's not that easy just to organize people just on the basis of having a common cause. And if you don't believe me, ask the people who actually run these organizations. And they will tell you, it doesn't matter what kind of organization it is, economic or citizen, liberal or conservative, I'll almost guarantee you a lot of them will tell the same story. It's like herding cats. It's difficult to actually get a number of people, even when it's in their interest to do so, to actually get on board and work together in doing something. If you've ever sat in some sort of volunteer organization, you know what I'm talking about. Trying to get people to donate money to what you think is a worthy cause, or just getting people to show up to meetings. Most of us know how difficult that is. The reason this is difficult is something that a scholar by the name of Mansur Olson pointed out way back in the middle of 1960s. He called it the logic of collective action. And what he meant by that is all of these groups that we're talking about, doesn't matter if it's the AARP or even Koch Industries or the NRA or the ACLU, there is something that they have in common in terms of what they're fighting for. They're what scholars call collective goods. Think about something very basic. If the ACLU goes to court and manages to win some sort of expansion of First Amendment rights, or some sort of restrictions on police power that could infringe on what seem to be people's civil liberties if they're accused of a crime, if the ACLU wins that, well, who benefits from that? Is it just the members of the organization? No, because when the judge is going to hand down a ruling, it's going to say what? That, in effect, all citizens have these rights under the First Amendment to do X. That all citizens have a right, whatever state they belong to. If they're accused of this crime, this is how the procedure is supposed to work. And that applies to everybody, whether or not you're a member of the ACLU. Or think about it this way. If the NRA goes to court or gets legislation that expands gun rights, who does that benefit? Just the members of the NRA? No. That would be on the basis of everybody across the country. Or AARP. Back in the 2000s, the AARP was campaigning for an expansion of Medicare to include prescription drugs, for example. Was that given just to the members? Obviously not. That was an entitlement given to everyone 65 years or older. Here's the nub of the problem. Well, that's what we mean by collective goods, really. These examples are all examples of what I'm talking about with collective goods. These are things that we all share, okay? And you can't exclude somebody else from getting the benefits of a collective good, from the benefits of a collective good. Everybody ends up getting it. It's like a public park or clarity of the air, free of air pollution, for example. We all benefit from that. The reason we're sitting here, most of us are sitting here wearing masks, for example, has to do with we're all trying to share the same air and want it to be COVID free as much as possible. We share these things. The problem in getting people to work for collective goods is that second point. It's called free riding. Suppose you're not a member of the NRA, but you do actually you actually have an arsenal in your own home that you're proud of and you want to build up further, and you don't necessarily want to be bothered by federal regulations about, say, ammunition, about who makes the ammunition, where you get it from. If the NRA goes and gets expanded legislation or court cases that rule in your favor, guess what? You can get the benefit of that and not ever set foot in one of the NRA meetings or send any money to them. And guess what? This kind of drives the organizers of NRA a little nuts, because all sorts of people can benefit from what they do without them actually contributing to the organization. Same thing, you can tell where I'm going with this, ACLU, AARP. If people can actually get the benefits of a collective good, but not lift one finger to do anything, that's called free riding. And a number of people, like we said before, if you've been a member of a volunteer organization, you've seen free riding firsthand. It can be very difficult to get people to do things, even when they profess an interest in doing so. Because if they can get the benefits without doing any of the work, let somebody else do it, for example, why bother? Why bother to show up? This is why, in some ways, looking at this problem of free riding, it actually tells us something interesting about how a lot of these interest groups work. Because one thing they all generally have in common is they're trying to overcome this problem of free riding. And the bigger the organization, obviously the more powerful it can be to be a voting bloc, to be sure. But the question is, how do you organize all those people? And here's an irony here. When you get to something as large as, say, AARP or AFL-CIO, and you've got tens of millions of members, organizing people becomes a serious problem. So if you talk to people who run AARP, the amount of time and effort they spend in just organizing lists of who's a member of the organization, where they live, so you can send out the magazines, and send out the various benefits, for example, that takes full-time work on the basis of AARP. Once you get into the millions of people, yeah, you form a big voting bloc. but now you've got a logistical organizational problem on your hands, all right? And if it comes to a point of saying, you go out there and vote for these particular candidates, or you go out and you write a letter, send an email, send a text to your congressman and tell them this, how do you check up on all those millions of members to make sure they do that? And with voting, you can't do that because people walk into their voting booths, they cast a secret ballot. You're never going to be able to check on them to see if they actually did what the organization wanted them to vote for certain candidates and parties that the organization wanted them to do. You've got an organization problem. Here is, and I should have had a slide about this. I realized later after I sent in the slides that there are really three ways that these organizations try to overcome this free riding problem, and all of them say something interesting about how these interest groups work. One thing that helps some of these organizations overcome the organization problems is something I alluded to earlier, simply the size of the organization. The bigger you are, the harder it is to keep an organization going. It's herding cats. And if you're herding tens of millions of cats, that's an even bigger problem. Ironically enough, some interest groups do a better job of organizing simply because they are small. This was one of the first things Mansur Olson talked about when he talked about organizations overcoming the free riding problem. He said that, ironically enough, even if bigger is better when it comes to the resources of power, bringing votes to the table, bringing money to the table, sometimes being smaller is actually the advantage when it comes to organization. If the organization is small enough, particularly small enough so that everybody knows everybody else in the organization, and that way you can do what? You know who is showing up to the meetings and who is not. You know who is contributing money and who is not. You know who is pulling their weight in the organization, who is not. Sometimes a smaller size makes it easier. Large organizations may have more resources, but smaller ones may have the more effective organization. And sometimes this says something interesting about our political process, even in a system where ideally the majority is supposed to get its way and the majority rules. Sometimes the minority gets its way, not necessarily because it has more votes, but simply because they're the ones that are more effectively organized. If there's a vote taken in Congress, for example, maybe the mass majority of people that want to see stronger regulations on the safety of products, maybe they're dimly aware of this, maybe not. But you know who's definitely going to show up? Those handful of businesses that make that product, they're going to be there. They're going to have representatives show up. They're going to be watching the Congress people, and they'll know who voted or not in favor of them, because being a smaller group, they're more organized. Notice something implied in what I said. Sometimes we often think to ourselves, oh, the reason those business interests, they have so much power is they have all that money. Well, yeah, they have money. Money is important. That's true. But we overlook a simple thing. If Koch Industries wants to organize something to sway legislation, it used to be, up until a few years ago, Charles called his brother David. They got on the line together, organized a few people in their organizations they could contact Congress people, or they could pay for various ads to run. It only took a small group of people. They could be effectively organized to do what they wanted to do, as opposed to, say, vast majority of concerned citizens who may have been aware of some of what was at stake, but it's hard to get them, millions of people all at once voting for ordinary, the interests of the ordinary person, for example. Oftentimes, one of the big things these business interests have that is an advantage for them is not just money, but just small size for more effective organization. A second thing that helps, I mentioned before that AARP had about 1.6 billion in revenue. That's not all from dues, all right? Some of you are aware of the perks of this organization. I know my father, for example, when we would go on vacation together, we would get separate rooms, to be sure. So we each had to go up separate, one at a time to the hotel desk clerk. And I might ask for a room, and I might be able to get a certain standard rate. What my father, who's now 92, what he would be getting? The discounted AARP rate. He'd get 10% off, which I couldn't get. And not only, discounts on hotels, but he got magazines in the mail. And, there's also insurance perks I'm told, for example. There's all kinds of things you get by being a member of the organization. So if you have a free riding problem, how do you overcome that? The second thing that organizations do, instead of being small, maybe you want to be large, you engage in what Olson called selective incentives. There are certain things you offer your membership that only go to your membership. And if you're not a member of the organization, guess what? You don't get that stuff. Okay. So I've had students in classes look this stuff up and contrast this. If you're a member of the ACLU, you can get invitations to various talks and meetings about state of American law and threats to civil liberties, for example. You can get a regular newsletter from the ACLU. And that, actually, that's about it. There was one time George H.W. Bush, the Republican candidate for president, accused Michael Dukakis, the Democratic candidate in 1988, of being a card-carrying member of the ACLU. It actually turns out the ACLU doesn't even issue cards for membership, or at least not at the time. They didn't even do that. Now, if you join, now I've had my students look this up. If you become a member of the National Rifle Association, you can get all sorts of lessons on guns and gun safety, all sorts of training, for example, about how to use of guns. There's also insurance perks for you as a member of the NRA, discounted rates of insurance like that for AARP. And in fact, for some of these larger organizations, because they're so large, they will negotiate some very interesting deals whereby, hey, if you're the one single insurance, favorite insurance firm for our organization, you get good terms from us. You in turn give preferential discounts to our membership. Some big deals go on with these, or between these organizations and say insurers or producers of perks. Because what do these big organizations want? They want to provide oftentimes as many perks as possible. If you join the NRA, there's discounted jackets, hats. I think even there are some vacation deals there with the NRA. I'm not sure. I didn't look this up. I remember one time one student was looking over a list of all the things you can get as an NRA member and said, heck, I want to join this organization. He wasn't even big on gun rights. He was interested in the perks. ACLU, 2 million members feeling they have a good, warm feeling in their heart if they give dues to the organization. NRA, 5 million members encouraged by the perks that go on there. And the last thing that often comes up as a way of overcoming free riding is what Olson called privileged groups, which I thought was a bad name for it because it doesn't quite get at what he's talking about. I think a better name for them, even though it's not as scholarly, would be white knights. If there are people free riding in your organization, sometimes the organization still organizes simply because some people believe so much in the cause they're willing to do the work, even if they know other people are slacking off. And when an organization has at least a core group of people in it that are willing to do the work, even if others don't want to, that can also help organization. This also says something interesting about interest groups and how they work, in that very oftentimes one thing that scholars have noticed, one thing scholars have, well, it goes back to I've asked my students sometimes in other courses, have you heard of the 20-80 rule? And a lot of them look at me funny, like, no, I haven't heard of the 20-80 rule. And it's simply this: in a volunteer organization, about 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work, is the way it's colloquially referred to. Again, if you've been a member of one of these organizations and when a few people show up, you probably know where I'm talking about. It's very common for the people who the officers of your organization to be doing lots and lots of work, and they're lucky if the rank and file members actually show up to a lot of meetings or to a lot of the common projects the volunteer organization is trying to do. Consequently, who are these people who often are willing to do 80% of the work, even if they're a small group? They tend to be the biggest, most hardcore, true believers of the cause. And so this explains something that's very common among interest groups. It almost doesn't matter what kind they are, especially if they're citizen groups. Scholars have noticed that very oftentimes the leadership of interest group organizations tend to be more extreme and more hardline in their views than the rank and file members are. Well, guess what? If it's a question of who's going to show up to the meetings, who's going to run for office, who's going to do the organizing, and it's the people who are kind of milquetoast about it, who are going to free ride more often, guess who shows up to the meetings more often, throw in more of the work? It's the hardcore members, the people who are really serious about the cause. That is part of the reason why, this is often occurs. Somebody who represents People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals talks about how it's awful that people have pets. I'm just picking an example. My son is full of examples like this that he reads on the internet. Members of PETA would say it's awful that people wear furs, for example, or something, or leather or something, leather and something like that. And people wonder, why is that organization so far out there? Part of it is simply because it's not that the rank and file are out there. A lot of the rank and file are people who just like dogs and cats and want to see them treated very well. But the leadership will be the hardcore people that come up with views that make sometimes even the members go, whoa, how'd they come up with that? And it's not just PETA. I use a left-wing example, but the NRA had, the NRA once famously had a case where then President Charlton Heston held up a rifle and said, you'll take this out of, have to pry this out of my cold, dead hands, for example. And that raised a few eyebrows when he said that, for example, very oftentimes, because of privileged groups, sometimes organizations will pull off to the extremes in ways that don't necessarily even represent the rank and file of opinion in the organization. Consequently, all of these things I talked about, small size, making for more effective organizations, selective incentives, privileged groups, all of these shape the way a lot of these organizations work and say something about how they operate and why some organizations can be really effective as interest groups and others not so much. Now, I've been talking a lot about judicial nomination and just the interest groups themselves. When we come back, I'm going to move from talking about organizing people to organizing money and the role of information and how this all adds up to how it affects our politics. All right, we'll take about a 10-minute break. It's about 2 o'clock right now. Let's come back around 2:10. All right, thank you. This went on for a little longer than 10 minutes, but I had so many interesting questions and comments that it was worth spending a break that was longer than 10 minutes. Hitting a couple of highlights about some of the questions that I was asked. Let's see. Actually, I'm trying to remember all the questions I got now. I had one question. I had one question on compulsory voting. It was sort of a question really for the previous session I had. Compulsory voting is something that goes on in Australia, and their voter turnout rate is roughly around 95% of the population for a simple reason. If you do not vote in Australia in national elections, you can be fined for not voting. And so this is called compulsory voting. You are in effect to vote under you're required to vote under penalty of law effectively in Australia. And somebody asked me my opinions about that. Ironically, after talking about how I wasn't giving him any of my own personal opinions, he asked me my opinion about something, that compulsory voting. And there are different arguments back and forth about this question. I think, for some people, compulsory voting has a clear, obvious attraction to it, which is that we have a relatively low voter turnout rate in the United States compared to other countries. This could improve it. And maybe this would encourage more active citizen participation in elections, to be sure. Nevertheless, there could be arguments against. Number one, a number of Americans would feel that this is an infringement on civil liberties. Who says that, I should be told to vote if I don't want to? If that's a right, isn't that something I can exercise at my discretion if I want to do it or not? There would be, I think, particularly in American political culture, an emphasis on that question. More than that, I did respond to the questioner by saying there would be some concerns too, that if people were told they have to vote, some people may turn in what are effectively largely blank ballots, or start choosing names at random. There's possibility of danger of that. And it'd be hard to tell exactly how much of a problem that actually is and who's responsible for doing it. For example, it would be almost impossible to tell those things, but that might be a countervailing concern. There are options about trying to change voting laws that would increase voter participation without necessarily making people do so. Changing election day from Tuesday to a weekend or a national holiday, for example, or making it easier for people to register to vote. All of these things could increase voter turnout without necessarily making people vote. So that's where a lot of the debate, at least a lot of the debate in the United States, has largely been about that. I had, let's see, I also had a further question. One person, let's see. I'm going to have to go through a couple of questions came up about interest groups and lobbying, which I'll get to a bit later. One question which came out over email from Roy was, since super PACs don't have to reveal donors, what's to keep them from taking money from foreign governments or foreign government organizations? And another question had to do with the people who do the lobbying. That is to say, those people that are professional lobbyists representing the interest groups. What sort of rules on there for them, especially former Congress people who end up doing this kind of work? I can speak a little bit to that. Not necessarily all that expert, but I'll try and address both questions as well as I can. Let me back up and start talking about some of the way money plays a role in politics. Money plays a role in politics, particularly in the question of lobbying. As I mentioned before, a lot of what I was talking about before the break had to do with this question of organizing people in terms of having political weight behind an interest group. Often involves having lots of people as members of the group, organizing them effectively for political action, like voting, contacting Congress people, for example. And organizing people is one method that interest groups use to exert power in the political system. But we can also talk about organized money, and later on I'm going to be talking about the power of information, okay? And I'll get to what I mean by that later. Some laws concerning the role of money and interest groups. Way back in the 1950s and 1960s, there weren't that many rules and there weren't that many laws governing the use of money in lobbying. And I remember one time watching a documentary where Bill Moyers, remember Bill Moyers used to do a lot of stuff on public television. He would, he used, before he was a journalist, he worked for the Johnson administration on public relations for the Johnson administration. And I remember one time when he was talking about politics in an interview with somebody, he said he remembered times when somebody could walk into a congressional office building carrying a briefcase. The briefcase may be full of bills, dollar bills. He would walk in, walk out, and the money would be gone. Nobody would claim to know exactly where the money went. And there was, one time, some serious problems with bribery. And some people would figure, well, there still are, aren't they? The rules started to change, particularly in 1974. That year, of course, should strike a chord with a number of you. What was the big story in 1974? We were coming in at the high point of the Watergate scandal, or the investigation of the Watergate scandal. So we had already learned about a fair bit of skullduggery on the part of the Nixon administration and their involvement in the Watergate scandal. As news of this broke, relationships between the media and politicians started to break down in such a way that the media would no longer necessarily try to gain access to politicians just by currying favor, getting cozy, writing stories that were generally positive, or allowing politicians to explain their views. But there was a lot more of a watchdog function, because it became clear for members of the media there was papers to sell, advertising time that could be sold on news stories if people were riveted by stories of scandal. So it didn't stop with the Watergate affair. More and more stories started to come out, especially in the early 1970s, about how Congress people were engaged in various scandals that involved bribery and so forth. And a number of Congress people realized something had to be done, because if a sitting president could be made to resign, if a sitting president who by his own admission said it defied every fiber of his being to leave office before his time, if he could be made to resign, what was going to protect various politicians from public opinion? They had to engage in reform. So in the 1974, Congress passed some laws setting up what were called political action committees, or PACs for short. This was a way of, in effect, regulating and providing a legal method of having money donated from interest groups to political campaigns. And what a PAC does is effectively it can serve as a fundraising organization, fundraising specifically for the purposes of donating money to election campaigns. And of course, usually these PACs are connected with some kind of interest group. Like I said, there's an egg PAC, which is specifically for the farmers that provide eggs for people, sell eggs. And there's different PACs for all kinds of trade associations and various groups. Just about a lot of them have a PAC. Let's see. The laws about this keep changing, but PACs can give up a maximum of $5,000 to a single candidate per election. Individuals, it used to be individuals could donate. Notice how the way that's phrased before I get to individuals. $5,000 to a single candidate per election. That is to say, the maximum amount of money a PAC can give is $5,000 to one particular politician who's running for office, be they the incumbent or the challenger. And it can go to just up to $5,000 can go to just one politician. And if they want to give more money, they can give out more money to other politicians. They just can't give more than $5,000 to that one particular politician. And they can do it per election. That means you can give up to $5,000 for a person who's trying to win a nomination in the primaries, and then give up to another $5,000 more for a total of $10,000 for their race in the general election, but no more than $10,000 for a particular candidate in a particular year. How do we track this? There is a Federal Election Commission, the FEC, who is supposed to track all of this. The PACs are not only registered with the FEC, but they are supposed to give a complete accounting of all this money, who they've donated money to, who they've donated money to, and how many elections they've donated money to, and register that with the FEC. So a lot of the statistics and information we have about political action committees and how they work would come through this Federal Election Commission. Um, some people would argue what this did was well, at least the people who passed this law and other congressmen said this did some, this went some way in getting rid of a lot of under the table bribery. At least now you may not like the way money flows into election campaigns, but one could say there's at least some sunshine on this matter. That is to say, we can at least track who gave money to whom, whereas in olden days, this money wasn't tracked at all. For other people, as far as they're concerned, all this did was to replace a system of under-the-table bribery with over-the-table bribery. That being said, the laws changed, and if there's no way to track this. But if there is actually less bribery, it could be because some sunshine was let in on the process. For some people, that's not necessarily enough. They'd rather see the money just go away, but it is part of the process, obviously. For a long time, the only way that you could legally support a politician in an election campaign was through these PACs. That was really the only way to do this. Or you could have money. There used to be something called soft money, where interest groups could donate unlimited amounts of funds to political parties. This used to be called soft money. And there was an attempt by Senator John McCain, a Republican, and I'm forgetting. Oh, there was a Wisconsin Democrat who was also part of this as well. I'm blanking on his name. They helped push a law through Congress, which would try to ban this kind of soft money, where interest groups or PACs could donate unlimited amounts of money to political parties. Parties, in turn, would disperse that money to the various people running under their banner. And that would be a way that parties would have some influence, some financial leverage to hold under the people that were running under their party ticket. McCain and Feingold tried to get rid of this soft money, and they did manage to succeed in passing a law, but the courts struck that down as being an infringement. Things started to go even further in terms of widening the access for money. Back around it was, the middle of the 2000s. Yeah, the middle of the 2000s. A group called Citizens United bankrolled a movie that was simply called Hillary the Movie. You can kind of figure out who the subject of the movie was. It was Hillary Clinton. It was described originally as a documentary about Hillary Clinton. Now, Citizens United made no secret about this. They were a conservative group. In their documentary about Hillary Clinton, they laid out the dirty laundry of all the sort of things that they thought was wrong with Hillary Clinton and why she would make a bad presidential candidate. Notice this is the mid-2000s. The word on the street everybody knew was that Hillary Clinton was most likely going to be, if people bet money, people figured the odds on a candidate who's going to be the Democratic nominee for the presidential race in 2008 was going to be Hillary Clinton. Strange activities of politics being what they are. She wasn't the nominee in the end, but as we all know, Barack Obama was. But because she was the leading contender at the time, Citizens United put out what some critics of Citizens United would have called a 90-minute attack ad on Hillary Clinton, for example, or for conservatives, it was an expose. Call it what you will. They ran afoul, according to FEC, saying what you did is you spent way in excess of, sort of money we're talking about, in terms of what's limited to, participate in an election campaign. And Citizens United took this to court. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. And in a case that's more popularly known as the Citizens United case, the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United. I think it was on a 5-4 vote. I'm not sure about that. Don't quote me on that. But the Supreme Court sided with Citizens United on the grounds that what the FEC did in trying to restrict Citizens United was an infringement on their civil liberties, that this was a First Amendment issue. Dissenters said, no, this is a campaign finance issue. We've got to be, there is a compelling public interest the FEC has in terms of the integrity of elections. The majority of the court disagreed and said, look, Citizens United has as much right to speak their mind as any other group does. And if they want to spend their money on, making a movie and saying what they will about presidential candidates, that's their right under the First Amendment. Congress had to respond by putting this into law, by taking this decision and working the law around it, in effect. So a special provision in the tax code a special new provision was written into the tax code The clause is called 501c4 to create a new kind of nonprofit group. These are now colloquially known as super PACs. These organizations, being nonprofit, are tax exempt, and they can get this 501c4 categorization under tax law, giving tax exemption, as long as their majority activity is some kind of social welfare activity, and that includes, participating in, election debate, for example. That would count under this. These groups can organize and spend as much money as they want on these kinds of activities without having to run afoul of the IRS or paying taxes on the money they use to do this. All right. And under the tax law, they are not required to reveal who their donors are necessarily as part of this. Hence, a new wrinkle occurred starting in the mid 2000s, which we see on just about so many campaign ads. You see a person, Republican or Democrat, running a campaign ad, and somewhere towards the end of that ad is, "I'm so-and-so and I approve this message." When we were all younger, we never saw that before, but there's a reason for that. If you do not see a politician saying, "I'm so-and-so and I approve this message," chances are what? It's one of these 501c4s that paid for the ad. All right. And so one of the restrictions that these super PACs have is that they can participate in running ads for political campaigns. They can spend as much money as they want doing that, but they can't officially coordinate their activity with that of a specific election campaign and the person running for office. The two of them are supposed to be separate, and the money for those activities are supposed to be kept separate. So that's why when you see a person running for office, they'll say in their own ads, "I'm so-and-so, I approve this message." That's distinguishing their campaign and what their campaign spent money on, as opposed to anyone else, which is most likely a super PAC running some sort of ad, attacking the other side or promoting a certain cause. All right. And of course, it's not just conservative groups like Citizens United, but groups of both sides of the political spectrum have been doing a lot more of this now. This has led to a fair bit of concern, understandably. Hence the question that came in online. If super PACs don't have to reveal donors, what's to keep them from taking money from foreign governments or foreign government organizations? Good question, because it is actually illegal under US federal law for foreign governments to spend money on election campaigns in the United States, and it is illegal. It's illegal for them to try and sway. It's illegal for them to spend money on this. If members of foreign governments want to sway the federal government, they should supposed to be doing that through their embassies and their diplomats, but not through election campaigning. I'll be honest to the person who asked this question. It's not entirely clear how the FEC or the IRS, or particularly the IRS, which handles these questions about tax exemption, would handle this. I think if word was leaked, for example, if it became known and somebody could prove in court, if a federal official could prove in court, we now have evidence that some of the money came from a foreign government, these groups, these super PACs, could lose their tax exempt status. And they're not only, and therefore the IRS could start to say, okay, this organization, you now owe us lots of money, and possibly in a way that could stop the organization's activity in its tracks. Short of that, I'll be honest, I'm not sure that there is much in the way of being able to make sure that super PACs are not receiving money from these organizations. There is debate about this. For a lot of people, super PACs represent an insidious force, especially when it comes to this question of you don't know where the money is coming from. Our illustrious fellow citizen, Charles Koch, has been, of course, implicated to quite an extent in documentaries like Kochland and other books, or documentaries like Kochland, for example, and others, about funneling lots of money from Koch Industries into various campaigns like this, for example. And some people think this represents a way that some wealthy people, especially like Charles Koch, can exercise undue influence in swaying opinion, not just at national level, but some people have argued, some of the campaigns on referendum here in Wichita bear the stamp, for example, of money spent by Charles Koch on local questions. Even the question of whether or not we should fluoridate the water in Wichita, back and forth. Koch was known to be against that. Some people argued a fair bit of the money, for the campaign against fluoridating the water came through Koch, for example, and was affecting even the local election. Not everyone's necessarily agreed. And I remember the last time I taught this course 2 years ago, one student, and I believe he's here now, mentioned that there's an arguable reason for that secrecy. If you're a part of one of these PACs and you're trying to run ads or speak your mind about a cause and run attack ads, the secrecy may be useful for making sure that politician, should they win office, doesn't come after you later and try to use political pressure on what he or she sees as political enemies, for example. So there are defenders of secrecy in this regard. However, that's not necessarily the very popular view, understandably. For a lot of people, these super PACs do represent an insidious force of money in politics, especially when this question is about exactly where's the money coming from. Could it be coming from sources that are actually illegal? That's an overarching question. On top of that, like I said before, both the Constitution also gives the House and the Senate the power to write its own rules of operation. And what that comes with is there are rules, for example, about the behavior of House members and Senate members in accepting gifts. Let's see. There's any number of cases you can talk about in this regard. One Republican senator from Alaska named Ted Stevens came under investigation in the Senate because, interestingly enough, quite a lot of work was being done on his private homes in Alaska by contractors. And it was noted that Stevens had backed a lot of legislation that was fairly favorable to contracting interests. He was getting some remarkably discounted work being done on his own personal homes, and was accused of kickbacks, for example. It's not just a Republican question, of course. It spans parties. When Charles Rangel, a longtime representative from a largely minority population district in New York, had been serving in that seat for a long period of time, towards the end of his long career in the House, he had come under a lot of accusations that he had been accepting all kinds of gifts that under House rules were not acceptable. Questions too about, suppose a senator or representative writes a book and surprise, surprise, huge numbers of copies of that book are sold. And the person goes on speaking tours where their travel expenses into the tens of thousands of dollars are paid for by some organization. These kinds of questions come up routinely and are often the subject of the kinds of investigations, for example, of Senate or House rules panels who are supposed to enforce rules against this kind of thing. One Speaker of the House back in the early 90s, Jim Wright, at one time he was the guy more famous before Newt Gingrich took over the position in 1994. Jim Wright was a big figure in American politics as Speaker of the House. He ran afoul of this because apparently he published a book and was accused of getting a lot of kickbacks through book tours and a lot of books being sold. Some organization will just buy hundreds of copies of the book, and suddenly became that politician a lot richer. That's the kind of thing I'm thinking about. And he had to resign his House speakership because he was seen to be running afoul of those rules. Question also came too. Let me get to it a bit later. What is the money spent on? Part of what we can also, it's not just the rules about how the money works or questions about how often those rules are followed, which we need to pay attention to, but, thinking of Watergate, following Watergate, Bob Woodward was told repeatedly, follow the money, for example, by Deep Throat. It pays here too, if you want to understand, how the influence of money works, follow the money. Where does it go? Where is it, what does it spend on? Who gets the money? When the money is spent on campaigns, and notice something simple that I touched on earlier, not all of the money is directly spent on campaigns, but a lot of it is. When the money is spent on election campaigns, it can go for a lot of different things. What we normally think of is what I've been talking about already, campaign ads. But election campaigns run on more than that. If you're going to organize, up until this year, if you're going to organize people to go door to door, you need staff people. Yeah, a lot of these people are volunteers and a lot of people volunteer to do that, but who organizes them? Often these people are not volunteers. These are often paid campaign staff who make their living going from one election to another. They need to be paid. They're making their living doing this kind of thing. Or, for example, people who know how to run computers and run the numbers to analyze which voters in the district are the more likely ones you want to target, for example. These sort of people have a sort of technical expertise that needs to be paid for. So staff needs to be paid for. And the higher up you go in the election, in terms of the higher up you go in terms of election campaigning, especially for presidents and senators, the more traveling you're expecting these people to do. Traveling requires money that has to be paid for. That's where some of the money can go as well. When the interest groups are not spending money on election campaigns, what are they spending money on? Part of it is professional lobbyists. People, like I said, in suits more expensive than my own, will go and make appointments to go talk to legislators, and not just with legislatures, but we know through, for example, the Boeing crash that came, the crash of the Boeing planes that have come out, unfortunately touched a nerve here in Wichita and other places as well. Regulators of federal agencies may be the ones who are, asked to make appointments with representatives of various trade associations and corporations. Oftentimes, the very ones they're trying to regulate, for example, they'll meet together as well. The people who do this kind of work, of course, they're professionals at what they do. They have to be paid for. And so this process is called inside lobbying, in the sense that it's inside the beltway, inside its activity that goes on inside that circular highway, the 270 that goes around Washington, D.C. These people actually do their work inside Washington, D.C., and make their work. And this is normally what we think of as lobbying. But think, too, about the process of work of trying to gather public pressure to put on politicians, for example. That's called outside lobbying. That needs to be paid for as well. And like I said, just the work of trying to contact members of an interest group, trying to encourage them, go contact your congresspeople, that's money. That's activity that requires money as well. All of these things are places in which money is spent on. So lobbying takes, of course, a variety of forms involving money involved in lots of different ways. Who gets the money? You can see that on the right-hand side of the slide. The natural question most people ask is, well, who's getting more of this money? Is it Republicans or Democrats? The answer is it almost doesn't kind of matter. The key thing that's understandable in terms of who gets a lot of the money is incumbent politicians. It doesn't matter what party they represent. Oftentimes, that's for a simple reason: better the devil you know than the devil you don't. If at least if you have an incumbent politician, you know their voting track record. You know how they voted on things. You've heard their stump speeches. You know the kinds of things they've often stood for. You can get a sense who's backing your positions and who's not. And a lot of times what the money goes to, well, let me put it this way. Side note, I did have one person come up to me in the break time of the last class, and she told me a story about how she had a friend who worked for a senator, I believe it was, or a major congressperson and so forth. And she had quit working for this guy after a while because she noticed that he would say a lot of things in public about a certain position, blah, blah, blah. And when her friend had discovered maybe 3 or 4 major donors would give this guy a call, suddenly he would change his mind about things and start espousing a slightly different or sometimes entirely different view. Yes, this is the way we normally think of lobbying, that the money is put on politicians to make sure to change the views that they have. I would submit to you a lot of what often goes on is something that doesn't seem as insidious, but is more common for an obvious reason. It doesn't so much change the opinion of incumbent congresspeople so much as it reinforces them. That is to say, like I said, it goes back to, I was thinking about this when I was saying before, when you've got an incumbent politician, you know what they've stood for, you know their voting record, you pretty much know. Maybe you don't have a shot of changing their minds, but if you know that they've been supporting your positions in the past, what do you want to do? You want to keep them there for as long as possible. So shovel more money into their campaign to make sure they keep getting elected. And in turn, hopefully they'll keep voting the same way you've always wanted to. It may not be manipulation, but it's a way of trying to preserve your policy influence in the system by keeping those people in charge as long as possible. Hence, incumbent politicians sometimes find they have a fair bit of discretion sometimes in what they want to say. There's always some sort of group that likes it and will donate the money as soon as they've made those positions very clear. Not to say that politicians aren't swayed by money in some cases. That goes on, to be sure. But I think a lot of times, too, it's a reinforcement effect. That's often what's going on. That's political influence as well. The party that's currently the majority party in the Senate or the House usually ends up getting more money. Surprise, surprise. No real surprise there, because if they're the ones in charge, people want to have access to them much more than the minority party. But what this does mean, and we can actually track this with statistics about PACs, is that when party control of the House or the Senate switches from one party or another, interestingly enough, sometimes the money flows from one party or another, following who has majority control. Obviously, you want to keep that majority party on your side rather than against it. So in questions, there are times, an obvious question will come up, and it is true. Would Republicans get more money from corporations than Democrats? Generally, that is correct, because Republicans generally have been the more business-friendly party, and the more business-friendly party. The Democrats, on balance, have been friendly, also friendly to business in their own ways, to be sure, in many ways. But they also incorporate labor unions as part of their voting coalition, and is generally seen to be relatively the more anti-business party. Yes, business and trade groups will sometimes favor Republicans more than Democrats, but still, these questions about incumbency and who's the party in charge of a Congress, these turn out to matter a bit more than even those ideological considerations do, it turns out. Now, I mentioned, this is often what we think about when we think about the power of lobbying. We often have money very much in mind. But starting around the 1990s, some scholars started investigating and playing around with a new notion that just looking at money and looking at votes doesn't actually even tell you the whole story of how lobbying actually works. And some scholars in the 1990s started developing an idea that maybe the single biggest resource, even the single biggest resource of power that some interest groups have, is not even the money, and it's not even the amount of votes they can command. It's, interesting enough, information. To follow the logic of this argument, think about things, interestingly enough, not from the lobbyist point of view or the interest group's point of view, but think about things from the politician's point of view. If you're going to be a politician and do your job, how do you know how to do your job? What sort of information do you need to stay in office and do your job properly? Well, politicians do need to know a number of things, fairly obviously. Number one that's up there is re-election chances. If I take these positions, if I do these things, if I push these particular issues as being more priority important than others, what are my chances that I'll get reamed in the next election or actually reelected? How do you find out stuff about that? Well, yes, you can look at polls. And very oftentimes people look at politicians and say, oh, well, they're just driven by what the polls say. They'll just do what the majority of people do, or there are certain vested interests that tell them this is what they do. But sometimes what a politician really needs to know is, are there surprises for me in store? Yes, a lot of incumbent politicians, they've got a relatively good chance of getting reelected, but there have been some cases, a number of cases, where incumbent politicians have been caught by surprise that some new issue has come up that they weren't expecting to be a big issue in front of the public, or opinion within the state or district has started to shift. And while they're going around slapping backs and shaking hands on tours, a lot of people come up to them and tell them, oh, what a good job you're doing. Oh, we really like what you're doing there. But they don't realize, because no one's telling them face to face, hey, under the ground, things are shifting and views are starting to change, and nobody's told you about that. Sometimes it's the interest group that comes out, sometimes it's actually the interest group who could honestly say, we represent a certain amount of voters in your state or district, and we are angry about this, or there's this new development cause, or this new issue that we're concerned about, and they're the ones who tell the politician, this is the new stuff that's going on. If you want to be on top of things, you got to listen to this. Or details about the legislative process. This one's a bit more esoteric, but if you're a legislator, what does your job involve? Well, you're not just talking to lobbyists. Yes, they do that a lot, to be sure, and they're raising money, to be sure. They do that a lot. Sometimes people sometimes people have noted, some ex-politicians have noted, they said they spent half their time on the phone trying to raise money, especially if a House representative is running every 2 years. Yes, they'll spend a lot of time trying to be on the phone raising money. But what's your other job? What's your normal day job? You're trying to get legislation passed. So what do? You have to attend committee meetings. And what do you do to raise support at committee meetings? You have to talk to various other legislators and say, where are you standing on this? What are you planning to do about that? And you can talk to legislators to be sure, but sometimes the people who know about what other legislators are doing is interesting enough, the lobbyists, because what are lobbyists doing? They've got appointments not just with one senator or representative, but they go around to various other people. And what can these lobbyists say? They can play a game of gossip. Oh, did you know Senator so-and-so is thinking about introducing this bill into committee next week? No, I didn't know that. That's interesting. Or did you know so-and-so is planning to call for an early vote on this? No, I thought we were going to have that vote in November. Oh, that's interesting. And sometimes what the lobbyists have is not so much, here, we can offer you this money, or we represent so many people. But did you know this detail about what so-and-so is doing? Did you know that this was actually in the works? Oh, that's interesting. Sometimes politicians are wanting to curry favor for lobbyists just because of the gossip they can get from these people, because they know how this process is working just as well as the politicians do. And details about policies and performance. Back in 2008, a lot of people were upset that they saw banks being bailed out, understandably. Taxpayer money was going to a number of organizations, which, as far as many people were concerned, caused the recession in the first place. And people would wonder, how was it that banks were getting all this money? Common answer was, well, of course, they donate a lot of money to politicians. Of course, they were getting bailouts. There's actually more to it than that. Because when the financial system is melting down, I found this out watching a PBS documentary. It turned out that as Bear Stearns, and what was it? A few others, I can't remember the name of all 5 of the investment banks off the top of my head. Morgan Stanley, more than that, there was another one that was also starting to go down. As some of these big investment bank names were going down, it turned out, I didn't realize this, but the US Treasury had no information about the balance sheets of any of these big investment banks. Nobody had written any legislation requiring the banks to tell or report to the government on a daily basis, these are our assets, these are our liabilities. This is how exposed we are. And so as the financial crisis is unfolding, it's only as it's unfolding that the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve start to learn details about just how exposed a number of these investment banks are. Here it gets to the power of information. If you're going to solve this crisis, what do you need? You need to know what the extent of the problem is. You need to know who owes money to who. Who has that information? Only the banks do. Only the people involved in the financial network actually do know a lot of the details about this as it's coming to light. So when it comes time to, okay, how are we going to solve this problem? Well, you need to know what the problem is, how far it goes. Who has the information about that? The banks do, the financial information too. How do they pitch that information? This is what we're going to need to solve this crisis. And there was, to be honest, a fair bit of rationale for saying, if we don't bail out these banks, we're talking about a systemic-wide freeze where the whole banking system can come to a halt. And we may not have, so many banks go out of business that we don't even have a financial system. I'm not exaggerating here. Some people thought it was honestly that bad. And at one point, something called the interbank market, where banks loan money to each other, froze one day. And nobody was exchanging anything with anybody else. There was arguably a rationale, but the rationale was in a sense fashioned from the banks who had here's the key thing, the monopoly of the information on what was going on. And so interest groups can provide all kinds of critical information, and sometimes in some cases, they're the only ones who can provide it. When you have not just a lot of something, but the monopoly on something, and the key thing may be information, that can be power to wield as well. Now, how does all of this add up? How does all of this add up? Basically, in the study of American politics, there are 2 broad views about the role of interest groups in lobbying. Interestingly enough, a long time ago, the right-hand view was the dominant view and the left-hand view was the minority view. And in the past few decades, it's swapped around. The left-hand view is a view that could be called the power elite view or the elitist view. And I'm not saying this because some people think that a few should be lording all the political power over others. Quite the contrary. On the left-hand point of view are a number of people, often ordinary citizens, who often feel that the system has been corrupted. We have what is ostensibly a democracy, but thanks to interest groups, the power of a few who are well organized and often very wealthy get to dictate policy for a lot of the rest of us. And it goes to, and for some people, the sort of view is this: what interest groups and lobbying ends up meaning is that democracy doesn't work the way we're taught in schools that it's supposed to. That if you are small and well organized and wealthy, for example, if you have, say, key information on policy questions like the Boeing crash, for example, it was basically only engineers at Boeing that knew exactly how bad the problem was. All right. And the FAA wasn't even told, or the FAA, unfortunately, has kind of stood back. There are reports now about this. The FAA kind of stood back a bit and let Boeing decide for itself about how the safety protocols were going to be done. If they have the key, not only the money, but the information. If you're Koch Industries and you have the money to hire lots of lawyers, or the NRA. And granted, the ACLU does this too. You can apply your money to lawsuits, bring things to court, and then the court says, this is how we interpret the Constitution. Everybody has to do things this way. You add all that up, that is a lot of different forms of power for a lot of people in terms of how a few who are small, wealthy, and organized can end up dominating politics, which for a lot of people who believe this is what goes on is a travesty, because we're supposed to live in a system where the majority rules. There's a lot that could be said for this view. And as I said, I've heard it sometimes said that when we're teaching politics to students, young adults, we ought to be careful not to reinforce some sort of high school vision that they've been brought up about how the majority always gets what it wants and we're a government of the people, that we ought not to reinforce the naivete of our students. I don't agree with that for a simple reason, because when I talk to students, I don't see a lot of naivete at all, frankly. If anything, if I were to ask them how politics works, they'll rattle off in their own words that left-hand point of view. Okay. And it's not as if they necessarily got taught in high schools a kind of view, I think, that said the American Republic's always wonderful. And now, granted, they'll believe in the Constitution a lot. They'll believe in the Constitution. They'll have been brought through checks and balances and why that's a good thing. But underlying that, they'll watch the news, same news that we all do, and have absorbed the same cynicism a lot of us have had about a worry about how the wealthy have too much influence in politics. There is an older view that I try to impress upon students called the pluralist view, which does, I think, also deserve some consideration. Not that the left-hand view is necessarily wrong, but maybe it doesn't say everything about how our politics works. The right-hand view, which is called the pluralist view, actually goes back to one of the key founders of the Constitution, James Madison. When the Constitution ended up being finished being written, and Madison, Hamilton, and the others needed to campaign to get it ratified by the various states, Madison got together with Alexander Hamilton and another man, John Jay, who later became our first Chief Justice. Excuse me. They got together and wrote a series of papers advocating for the adoption of the Constitution we have now. And since they were advocating for a stronger federal government, these papers became known as the Federalist Papers. There's over 100 of these different essays that they wrote. In the 10th essay, which we now know as Federalist Paper number 10, Madison addresses what may seem to us an odd question. How could a republic survive in a country so large? That strikes us as an odd thing, because looking back over 200 years of history, well, yeah, the republic survived and survived for a long time in a country that's arguably the fourth largest territory in the entire world. Yeah, it survived, and it survived pretty well. Why would anyone have been worried about that? It turns out in the time the founders were thinking and writing, only small cities actually managed to have forms of government called republics that had survived for any length of time. Any large territories used to be governed by monarchs, emperors, and were in the form of large empires. Nobody had ever seen a republic over a large landmass of territory before. And Madison addressed this question about, well, how can we make sure the republic survives, given that we have 13 different states? Yeah, they all speak English, but they're from very different parts. New Englanders didn't necessarily trust Southerners. Mid-Atlantic states didn't necessarily feel they had things in common with the other states. How can we make sure that republic survives? Madison actually argued, a large size may actually work in a republic's favor for a simple reason. The larger the territory and the more diverse, the bigger the population, the more diverse the population. The founders, and Madison in particular, were concerned with something they called factions. We don't use that. It's an old-fashioned term. We don't use it nowadays. But they used the term factions to mean what we would now call an interest group, or a political party. Any group of people that represented a subset of the nation that were trying to gain enough power to control policy. Madison said, yeah, there's worries that he was worried, we could be worried about the power of factions. How can we be sure that in a large republic like ours, we don't just get everybody together on the same page, but we can also make sure that it's being run for the interests of the whole country? And what Madison argued in Federalist Number 10 is our large size may actually help in that, like I said, bigger population, more diversity. The more diversity you have, the more factions you would have. The more factions you would have, the more they can counterbalance one another. In that when a republic so large, it would become less and less likely that one small faction could really dominate all the rest, because the other factions could gather up their political power and start putting political pressure to bear on anyone who's trying to run the whole system. Hence, Madison not only set up a system of checks and balances to restrain the politicians, but he argued our large size may have a kind of checks and balances system at work effectively to make sure that one faction doesn't dominate all the rest. So in the pluralist view, notice that it's not just big corporations that exercise influence. Ordinary people do this too. I read somewhere in the Economist news magazine, one reporter written, politicians ought to be aware of the Richard Scarry rule. You remember Richard Scarry wrote those little, cute little books for children with all those detailed drawings about pigs and rabbits, doing various jobs. He said, what politicians have to be aware of, if you go after a certain group of people, all right, and they show up very commonly in children's books, police, teachers, shopkeepers, for example, or police, teachers, doctors, or something like that, you be careful going after them because they get public sympathies, okay? Now, if it's groups of people that don't show up in children's books that often, bankers, insurance agents, go after them as much as you want. They don't have public sympathies for the most part. But notice something. Police organize as a way for an interest group. In fact, a number of police unions across the country have already endorsed Donald Trump for president, for example. Teachers unions get together and they endorse candidates and donate money to campaigns. And a lot of teachers unions have been known for being strong Democratic supporters. Even though there are conservative teachers, a number of teachers unions have often come out in favor of Democratic candidates for a long while. These groups also organize. They're not necessarily big and wealthy people that we're talking about, but they have a role to play by organizing. And what some people have argued is that if you actually look at the political parties, they're not just dominated by wealthy interests, but parties can be seen as coalitions of groups. For the Republican Party, for example, arguably is a coalition of not just corporations and business interests, but also evangelical Christians, gun rights activists, for example. And on the Democratic side, you can talk about them as being a coalition of different groups of minority racial categories, feminist groups, environmentalists, labor unions, and that different groups make up make up the parties, for example. And that Madison's logic is kind of playing itself out in ways in American politics. This view has somewhat declined. I have to teach people this kind of view because it doesn't come naturally, I think, to a lot of people. They've never heard of pluralism as a way of looking at American politics, but it's another way to talk about the role of interest groups. What's interesting here, and I realize my time is coming up short, but the upshot is very simple. The power elite view, which does have its evidence and its valid way of looking at things, does invite us to understand what goes wrong with lobbying and what the dangers of interest groups are. that they can sometimes serve as a way where the minority gets its way as opposed to the majority of ordinary people. But the pluralist view invites us to think that there's also some advantages to having interest group and interest group lobbying. That is, it can provide, interest group lobbying can provide a way whereby a huge variety of people can have a say in the American political system, and that power can counteract power in such a ways that checks and balances go on more than just in the ways of the way the federal government works as well. And that interest groups can accentuate American diversity as much as anything else. Allowing us to think in multiple terms allows us to sort of stretch our minds, I think, about the advantages and disadvantages of lobbying and the variety of roles that they play in American politics. We will, as I said, come to the discussion of governing, about how policies are adopted, and particularly those key institutions of the presidency and the Congress when we come back in our fourth and final lecture. Thank you for attending. And as usual, I'll be here in case to field any questions for a few minutes if you can spare the time. Thank you.